Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Jump On Air. We're so happy you've chosen to spend a bit of your Monday with us as we explore statistics, science, data, and of course, Jump. My name is Julian Paris. I am the Learning Strategy Manager here at Jump Software. And as always, I get the great privilege to be your host for Jump On Air. And a truly great Jump On Air it will be today because we have a very special schedule today of all sports analytics. And we have a really outstanding lineup here. We're going to have Sigma Dell here to talk us through what baseball can teach us about ourselves. We're going to have Clay Barker talk about Kobe Bryant. We really have a great schedule. And I won't list down all of these because that's why you're here. And so I want to get to them just as soon as possible. Now, before we get started, just to make a note, of course, that you can always rejoin the broadcast, jump.com/jumponair. So if you need to leave and you want to come back for your favorite segments, just hit that link on any device and you'll be reconnected right to our live stream. The link to remember after the show is community.jump.com/jumponair. And there you'll be able to watch all the full episodes, all the segments that you want to watch again or want to watch for the first time. And this is where you can also interact with all of our guests. So leave comments and interact with them on our community, community.jump.com/jumponair. I do want to make just one note about this. We've set it up before on the program, but I want to make sure you know that you can go to this page and using that side, you can click on any of the labels so that you can look at your favorite shows. So if you want to click on Ask the Data Doctor, you can see just the Data Doctor episodes. Or if you want to watch just full episodes, click on the episode guide and you'll see all of them listed there. So community.jump.com/jumponair is the one link to remember to watch all of our past shows. So just a couple quick announcements before we get started. As you know, this week is special. We have our sports analysis show today, and we have our special data analysis in science episode on Friday. Now, the keen observer will notice that there is no Wednesday Jump On Air show, and that is because we have a very special program this Wednesday, not by us, but actually our sister program, Stat Speaking. So Stat Speaking is a wonderful program where we bring experts in a panel discussion and a plenary. This time we have Nick Debris, who's going to talk about dashboards. So make sure you join us for Stat Speaking this Wednesday from 1 to 3. Jump.com/statspeaking to register. We'll all be there listening, so we hope you do too. Now, before we get started, we have a very special addition to the program. It wasn't actually on the website because Pete and Mary put together a very special tip of the day for us, this time doing graphlets on the NFL draft data. So to kick us off this time, we have Pete and Mary acting out real-life situations where a jump tip is going to be the answer to a problem.
Well, Pete, how are you today?
I'm great. I'm excited. There was at least some sports recently with the NFL draft, and
Yep.
and then they had to decide whether to pick up a fifth-year option on players or not. So,
I hope
I'm
the
here
Giants.
at Bronco
I hope the
Stadium.
Giants got rid of everybody.
Yeah.
Well, welcome everybody. This is Pete and Mary, and now we're going to try and make some fun out of football data. As you can see that I'm not social distancing behind me, but hey, what the heck?
Yeah, they're pretty quiet there at MetLife Stadium. I guess it's not doing so hot.
No. And I don't know about you, but I think the Giants, I don't know about the Broncos, they should get rid of all of their fifth-year options and start new. Start over again.
Well, let's take a look at the data. So
all right.
I'm going to share my screen.
All right.
And here you can see I've got all of the draft picks dating back to 2011 to 2017.
Yep.
To see who picked up the fifth-year option on their first-round draft picks. So first thing I wanted to look at was how many draft picks have come from each division. So I just went and launched my graph builder here, and I know Zan tells us not to put color on there for no reason, but I think it looks better with some color.
Oh,
so
yeah.
here is our division, and it shows, AFC West has the least amount of picks where the Broncos are, and the AFC North has the most. But this is a visual to sort of see where the picks have come from. You got questions?
So,
That doesn't quite
yes.
get to the answer, though, does it?
No, because I want to know what the Giants have done for their fifth-year option. So what can you show me about the NFC East?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I had also gone into Graph Builder and made this chart where I took a look at teams that had picked up options or not, and I did a quick mosaic plot. And this is a little busy for me. What do you think about that, Mary?
Oh, it's a little busy for me. My eyes can't focus that fine. I need a magnifying glass.
So let me show you a trick about this. So what I'm going to do is combine these two. So I'm going to go to the red triangle, go to Save Script to the clipboard. I'll minimize this one. I'll bring this graph back up. Right-click here, go to Hover Label, and paste Graphlet. And so you, unfortunately, are a fan of the Giants. So let's take a look at the NFC East.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and you see when I hover on this, I can just go and click, and that filter is applied by itself there. And now you can see not just the Giants, but how they compare to their division. And not surprisingly, they've kind of struggled.
Oh, they should get rid of 46% and start over.
Yeah, no kidding.
What about your Broncos?
Oh, yeah, good call. So we can look at the Broncos who've struggled recently as well. And not surprisingly, they've done horrible in the draft.
Well, I really like this idea of having a graph and being able to click on the bar and then bring up a secondary graph that makes more sense. Now I can read this graph opposed to that other mosaic plot that was really tight. Yeah. So this is called a graphlet?
It's called a graphlet, yeah. And you can just paste them in. Again, I'll show right-click, hover label, and select Paste Graphlet there. And then it will apply the filter for you.
Awesome. Well, thanks. I like that. Well, I don't like what the Giants are doing, but, you know, no. I like your tip and trick on graphlets. I think that's pretty neat because then you can kind of drill down and create the visual and just a visual. Instead of a workflow and clicking, it would be a visual flow.
Yeah. I like it.
I like it.
All right. Well, that's been our Pete and Mary's sports tip and trick of the day.
Go Giants!
Go Broncos!
Thank you so much, Pete and Mary. Just a reminder, you can visit our community to put your suggestions in for what tip or trick Pete and Mary will cover next. So community.jump.com/jumponair. In our next segment, I'm really happy we have Sig Mejdal, Vice President and Assistant General Manager for Analytics at the Baltimore Orioles, to take us through what can baseball data tell us about ourselves. Sig, welcome to the program. And hopefully we have Sig with us. There he is. And I don't hear you just yet, Sig.
Thanks a lot, Julian. And thanks for having me. And hello, sports fans. So as you know, it's a tough time. The baseball stadiums are completely empty. In this country anyway, and it is May. So that's a shame. With all the difficulties our country is going through, this would have been a great distraction. However, there are a lot of baseball websites that perhaps could satisfy your baseball fix. One of them, a popular one, is SeanLehman.com. And so this site gives you single season stats on every batter, pitcher, and fielder back to like 1871, and it's a great source for all sorts of goodies. It's got Hall of Fame, Cy Young voting, and so what I did and what I'll share with you in the next few minutes is I downloaded their master table. So it's seemingly one of the less interesting tables. It has every major leaguer that played. It has their birth dates, their birth city, their debut year, their height, their weight. So it seems like a pretty boring table, I'd admit. But let's see if we can't dive into it and maybe get some interesting insights some insights that might be bigger than baseball, maybe something about our country, maybe something about human nature. So the first curiosity I had with that is let's look and see where major leaguers come from. So here's a simple heat map of the country, and no surprise here, we see California producing a lot, Texas, Illinois, and New York. But here's where it really surprised me. We have Pennsylvania and Ohio as big producers. Now, I've been in baseball for 15 or 16 years and involved with the draft, and it's clear to me, at least anecdotally, California, Texas, and Florida is where the talent comes from. So I thought, well, maybe I'm looking at the wrong era. And if we looked at the days of old, we might see the explanation for this. So jump to the rescue again. So this is all 50 states. And on the x-axis is time. So we got from 1900 to current day. On the y-axis is the number of major leaguers making their debut that year from that state. So first thing I notice is California, and about starting in the 60s, there was just an explosion. We see something similar in Florida, starting also in about 1960, but more of a gradual increase. And then if we look at the two suspect states, Ohio, indeed we see that Ohio was quite a big producer prior. In 1920, it was a big producer. And then since then, it's gradually been going down. Now, I love this, and this is part of why I've been an analyst. Like, you look at the California and you see this strange explosion there, and you know there has to be a story about it. And Jump is so great in that it could reveal the differences in the data, but then it's really up to you to dive in and see what the story explaining that is. So let's do that. Let's dive in and see what's going on in California and Florida. So of course, the first place we're going to look is the population increase in general. So here's what I got. The California is in green, Florida is in blue, and you see about 1940, both states started increasing at a pretty consistent slope over the years, with California being a bit steeper. And this has to explain a lot of the production, because the people born in the 40s would be making their debut in the 60s, and that's really when we see the increase. But we saw an explosion in California, and we didn't really answer why we saw an increase in California and Florida. So Wikipedia gives us some help. And the answers to the California explosion is pretty clear, and it was real estate. Hundreds of land developers bought land cheap, subdivided, built on it. People moved there. They got rich. In 55, Disneyland came, and then a few years later, we had the Dodgers and the Giants come into California, which had to inspire the kids that were growing up there to be major leaguers. And it really is, when we see that explosion, I think it really is described by the baby boomers whose parents had moved to California because of the real estate development, probably inspired a bit by the Dodgers and Giants going there. So that may explain California, but Florida has a different story, and it's also an interesting one. So in Florida in 1939, yes, Florida was described as still very largely an empty state. And we see that in the data. It's flatlined. It's not producing anything. But the key to Florida was the availability and the affordability of air conditioning, and how that brought so many people to a relatively humid state. Later in time, many refugees fleeing the baseball crazed Cuba created what we see today, which is a lot of Cuban Americans coming from Florida and entering the minor leagues and the major leagues. And it wasn't just baseball, it was other sports that air conditioning really jump-started Florida's rise there. And so this explains the California and this explains the Florida. But if you remember, we saw Ohio and we saw Pennsylvania still increasing. Even though their population was going up, we saw a decrease in the major leaguers they were producing. And I think I have the answer to that. And then when baseball in 1903 settled on the teams that are going to finally have permanent major league teams, again, it was Ohio and Pennsylvania right smack in the middle of it. Now, of course, any kid growing up in this area, he's going to be in the epicenter of baseball. He's got to be inspired to play baseball, have dreams of being a major leaguer. But as time went on, right, baseball didn't just stay, obviously, in the Northeast. It expanded westward and it expanded southward. And so I imagine that average or that center production of where major leaguers come from must also have meandered westward and southward. And that idea reminds me a little bit of the famous bubble plot, the famous YouTube video by Hans Rosling, where he looked at global economic growth, and I think he really made bubble plots so popular. So of all the wonderful things Jump does, of course, it also does bubble plots. So I took a look at our country to try to see a bubble plot of how the average location of the major leaguers evolved over time. And so here you could see, I'm starting it. It's 1901, and the average location of major leaguers is right smack between Ohio and Pennsylvania. Now I'm going to forward it and run it to current day. We're getting close to World War II. World War II occurs. Baby boomers are born. Baby boomers grow up. We got the Giants and Red Sox moving. And now we're going to see this jump right about there when the baby boomers become of major league age. And you see how it moves to about the middle, halfway through Kansas and Oklahoma. And then until present day, it pretty much stays around there. It meanders a little bit, but you're sort of in the middle of Kansas and Oklahoma. So I'll stop it there. And this is one of the things I love about data, right? We have this baseball table that seemingly is just related to baseball, but now we know the stories of the California real estate developers. We know the importance of air conditioning in the South, and these two stories that seemingly have nothing to do with baseball are really embedded in this table. And with the help of Jump and a bubble plot, you could actually literally see the meanderings of and the spread of baseball westward and southward in our country. Another great thing to do with the locations is you could see where the hotbeds of major leaguers, where they came from. So each dot represents a major leaguer. And so you see many coming from the San Francisco Bay Area, Southern California, Chicago is clear. Here we have Boston, New York, Philadelphia, a few around Baltimore, DC area. We have Atlanta. We have the East Coast of Florida, the West Coast of Florida. You could see St. Louis. And if you squint, you could see Dallas and Houston. If you really squint, you could see there's a single dot in Cary, North Carolina, the home of Jump Software. It's a single player named Max Pofsy. So we could see what Max's career was like. Sure enough, he went to Green Hope High School, born in Cary, North Carolina. He played one season. He pitched 3 innings. gave up 9 hits, 5 runs, a 7.36 ERA. So you could see that Cary, North Carolina is a lot better at producing valuable software than it is valuable major leaguers. Now, those of you who have been involved in Jump for a long time may remember about 10 or 11 years ago, there was a conference, a Jump Discovery Conference in Chicago, and it was a great conference for many reasons. One of those reasons was that Malcolm Gladwell spoke. And at the time that he gave his talk, one of his books, Outliers, was a bestseller. And in that book, he describes the research coming from Canada. And of course, it's Canada. It was related to hockey. And in that, he describes how this researcher found that there's a giant preponderance of Canadian hockey players whose birth dates are January, February, and March. They're early in the year, and very few at the end of the year. And the reasoning behind that was that the Youth Hockey League age cutoff is January 1st. So if you're a kid in Canada, you know you're playing youth hockey. And if you're born in January, February, or March, you're going to be older than the opposition. You're likely going to be bigger. You're likely going to be stronger. You're likely going to be better. You're probably also going to like this sport. You're going to be inspired by it initially because you're good. Your parents are going to notice you're better than the others. They might think you're the next Gretzky. And so there's a good chance they're going to encourage this and support your hockey. And all this leads to a situation where you end up with a whole bunch of hockey players from the early months. So I wondered a couple of things. One, this was 10 or 11 years ago. I wonder if that's still going on today. And then secondly, if you see something like that in baseball. So here's a website. It's the Canadian National Hockey Team Junior. So this is from 2019. So these are like 18 or 19-year-old kids. And it's got their date of birth. So there's 20 players here. So I want to just go through quickly and count and see how many of these Canadians come from the early month birthdays. And so here's the first guy, Ty Smith. He's a March birthday. So there's 1. Another March, 2. January, 3. January, that's 4 of them. March, 5. So you see where this is going. Of these 20 guys, 9 of them have their birth dates early in the year. If you throw in the goalies, you get 10 out of 22. So almost half of the players are born in the first 3 months out of the year. So that's not likely by chance. But what I then wondered is, what about baseball? Do we see something similar with the difference in age and height in American baseball players? Now, it's not going to be as clean as the Canadian data because the schools in our states have a different age cutoff. That many of them are September 1st, where the September kids are going to be the oldest, but some have August 1st, and there's even a few with some other dates. So we wouldn't expect it to be nearly as clean, but maybe we could still see something. So the first thing I wanted to check out was, what is the normal distribution of birthdays? When do they come? And of the general population. So we first need to take a look at that. And so here's what Jump produced. So each dot is a birthday, is a day of the year. And to the right here, these are the most frequent birthdays. And over to the left are the least frequent. So you could see this is the month 12, December. So here's Christmas Day. Here's Christmas Eve. Here's the 26th of Christmas, the 23rd. This last one here is actually New Year's Eve, which, of course, your kid's going to be a tax write-off. I would think that would encourage the parents, but perhaps the moms want champagne, and that outweighs a desire. In line is April 1st. So I guess this is a case of parents not wanting their precious kid to be born on the Day of Fools. So this all makes sense. For those that are curious, the most popular birthday is September 9th. So I took this chart and just put it into a bar graph. So here are the birth dates of our population. So before I grab in the birth dates by month of the major leaguers and we see the difference, let's remind ourselves of the hypothesis. So the thinking is that the kids born in September or October, we're going to see more than our share of major leaguers coming from those months. Because as I said, when they're trying out for their junior high team, they're going to be the oldest, the biggest, the strongest in general. We're probably going to see June and July having a dearth of major leaguers. And again, in August, I don't know, sometimes it's the best month, sometimes it's the worst month. So why don't we grab the major leaguer birthdays and see. So drum roll, please. Thank you. And here we go. So we'll get back to this tower in a second, but let's look at our hypothesis. So we see, it looks like there's some evidence, right? That September or October, we see more than our share of major leaguers. And it looks pretty clear that in June or July, we're missing a lot of major leaguers for the Canadian effect we talk about. But August is an explosion, and I couldn't initially figure out why that was, what the story behind that data is. But I think I understand it, and maybe many of the parents know that. But if you have an August kid and you're in a state where the school starts September 1st, it's no mystery to many parents that your kid may be at an academic disadvantage, and as we're seeing, perhaps an athletic disadvantage too. So many parents hold their kids back. And so these August kids, instead of having the biggest disadvantage from their birth dates, they're even at a bigger advantage than the September kids. And of course, if school starts in August in your state, well, your kid has the advantage anyway. And perhaps the June and July holding those kids back is a little too much. So I think that explains what we're seeing in the data. And again, this is another example of what I love about analytics, right? We have parenting behavior from decades in the past making its way into this baseball data. And with a little bit of work, it could be revealed. Now, finally, the last thing I want to talk about is men, and men specifically lying about their height. So here's a Wall Street Journal article, and it says that every man wants to be 6 feet tall. Well, if that's the case, then we should see that in our major league data. So here's the height of major leaguers over the years. And this is in inches. So obviously 6 feet is 72 inches here. The most typical major leaguer is 6'2". So let's first look at the tall side of 6'2". And if you notice, we see a nearly perfect line as the frequency increases with the tall player. So we would expect we would see something similar to this on the undersized guys. And we start to, but then all of a sudden we see this giant leap for mankind followed by a small step for man. And I think this is obvious what's going on, right? That there's a good portion of these self-reported 6 feet tall persons that are really 5'11". And if they were telling the truth, I hope, I don't know, it gave you a little bit of a baseball fix and perhaps reminded us why we love analytics, that something as strange as or as unrelated to baseball as the development of real estate in California, the advent of air conditioning, parenting behavior, men's tendency to lie about their height, all of this is embedded and lives within our data, which I think is so cool. And this was all done with easily. Baseball Reference is similar. Baseball Reference is very similar. You got a wealth of data there. And then retrosheet.org is a great group that has play-by-play going all the way back to 1918. So you should be able to find something of interest there. And I'm with the rest of you. I'm waiting patiently for baseball to start again. I can't wait. But no, I do not have any inside information. I do not know when it's going to start again. But am, like you, really looking forward to it. And so thanks for a few minutes of your time here. And thanks, Julian, for having me.
Outstanding. Thank you so much, Sig. I'll be sure to get all those different links that you just shared so that our viewers can also check out the data for themselves. It was really fun to see the kinds of things you can just find in what otherwise people might just gloss over as just, raw baseball data. So there's always more things to learn, and I love to see how you use JMP to do that. Fantastic. In our next segment, we have Clay Barker, Principal Research Statistician Developer here right at JMP, to take us on a look back at Kobe Bryant's career. So Clay, welcome to the program.
Okay, thanks, Julian. So to get started, I wanted to talk a little bit about myself and why I'm such a big basketball fan. In the 1980s, my family moved to Atlanta, Georgia, and if you didn't follow the NBA, you wouldn't know that that's Dominique Wilkins or Spud Webb. Dominique was the human highlight film, a very exciting player, and Spud Webb was also a very exciting player. He was a great dunker, even though he was only 5'9". So it was an exciting time to be a Hawks fan, which is not always the case. They're not always such a good team. So then in the late 1980s, my family moved to Chapel Hill, and that is like one of the meccas of basketball, I think. To be an ACC basketball fan in the 1980s and the 1990s was just amazing. If you look at the slide here, we've got Dean Smith, the legendary coach, Vince Carter, who is actually a member of the Atlanta Hawks now, Jim Valvano, who was a legendary coach at NC State, is in the bottom right corner. And in the top right, your perspective on this sort of says whether you're a Duke fan or not. So that's Christian Laettner either stepping on a Kentucky player by accident or stomping on them. Sort of depends on your perspective. But this really got me into basketball. My mom was recently cleaning out their house recently, and she texted me a picture of this story I wrote back in elementary school. And if you can't see the title there, you can see the paper. It's got those holes punched on the side, so it tells you how. It kind of dates me a little bit, but it tells you that's a pretty old story. It was called The Day I Played Basketball at the Smith Center, and it was written by myself and my friend Tyree at the time. And it starts, one day Dean Smith asked me if I wanted to play basketball for UNC. Now it turns out it's not quite that easy to get recruited by UNC, and it would probably be a recruiting violation to ask third or fourth graders if they wanted to play for you anyway. But anyway, it just gives you an idea of how excited we were about basketball. And you can also see on the right there why I'm not doing a Zoom art class. My drawing skills haven't really progressed beyond that. But as you might have guessed, I didn't quite make it to the NBA, although there on the left you can see I used to play above the rim. And on the right, that's how I play above the rim now. It's a little bit different. Although if you see in the bottom of that picture, that's actually Rapunzel's castle, and I can dunk over that. Not everybody can say that. But why are sports statistics so important to me? When I was a kid, I got really into basketball cards and box scores. I would study them, very carefully, and that's what piqued my interest in statistics. And that's what, even in high school, I wrote a career report about becoming a statistician. So I got into statistics really young, and I'm really grateful for that. So I didn't make it to the NBA, but statistics is a pretty great, plan B. So like I said, sports statistics really became important to me. It plays a big role in where I've gotten to now. But it's also really important to me because it provides a fun way to talk about statistical concepts that maybe people aren't excited about. Not everybody follows sports, but a lot of people are interested in, and by talking about sports, I can get people interested in the regression concepts or clustering or whatever I might be talking about. So if you've seen me present before, you may have seen me talk about sports, music, TV shows. There's a lot of ways you can get people interested in statistics. Sports is probably my favorite. And before we get into Kobe Bryant, I just wanted to put this out there. If you can guess whose jersey I'm wearing today, it's the Grizzlies number 31. Put that in the Q&A or on the community in the comments. And if you can guess, I owe you a fist bump or something. Well, maybe not fist bumps anymore, but anyway. So let's move on. So we're going to be talking about Kobe Bryant's career, and this is a play off of Mamba Mentality, which is the name of Kobe Bryant's book, and he called himself the Black Mamba. So unfortunately, as you know, Kobe Bryant passed away in January alongside several people in a helicopter crash. But here's a little bit about Kobe. He was the first guard to play 20 seasons in the NBA. And he was the first player to play 20 seasons with a single team. To me, that's really cool. He played over 57,000 NBA minutes. That's about 40 days, and that's really impressive to me. He's also a very smart guy. He had a good SAT score, and he's fluent in 3 different languages. And there was a story this season about him trash talking Luka Doncic in Slovenian because he's a Slovenian player, which I thought was really cool. And there's a quote from Kobe Bryant that I really like. If you see me in a fight with a bear, pray for the bear. And I think that really says a lot about his fighting spirit and his effort. Some more of his accomplishments. One of my favorites is here that he won the 1997 dunk contest. I've always enjoyed the dunk contest and the three-point contest and all of the All-Star Weekend activities. He won 2 Olympic gold medals. He was the MVP in 2008. And even in 2018, he won an Academy Award, which is really cool. It goes to show, how talented he was just overall. So Kobe was, without a doubt, one of the best players ever. And he received a lot of criticism towards the end of his career that he was kind of falling off. So what I wanted to look at is how did his performance change over time, and what tended to impact his performance? Because I really wanted to know, was all that criticism fair? Did he really struggle that badly? So I got the data off of basketballreference.com. There's tons of places you can get these kinds of data, but that's my go-to webpage for getting basketball data. I think SIG referenced, baseballreference.com, they're in the same family. And I also want to mention the Internet Open feature in JMP. It can save you a lot of time importing data from web pages like this. And Basketball Reference is set up really well for Internet Open to import the data. So the model I'm going to fit is a lot like a model I fit in a blog post that I did after the 2015 playoffs. So in 2015, LeBron James was with the Cleveland Cavaliers, and they were playing my team, the Atlanta Hawks, in the playoffs. And as they were beating up on the Hawks, I thought, if I look at his season, I bet I can find a change point in his points, rebounds, and assists right when he started playing the Hawks, because he was playing so much better against us. And sure enough, you could find a change point in his points right when he started playing the Hawks. That's right here in this area. You could also see when his rebounds went up when Kevin Love got hurt, which is one of his teammates. You can see where his rebounds went up when Kyrie Irving got hurt, who was their point guard. So I'm going to fit the same kind of model, and I won't go into a whole lot of detail about it today, but if you're interested, check it out on the blog. So I'll be using a platform called the Generalized Regression platform. It's a personality of fit model. And I think it makes variable selection really easy and interactive, and it's got a variety of variable selection techniques. But today we'll use the lasso, which this is the form of the lasso. We're minimizing the sum of the squared errors plus a penalty on the complexity of those parameter estimates. And so back to my point about making statistical concepts interesting, if you haven't shut me off by now, then you've proved my point. We're talking about basketball. If I was just telling you we're going to use the lasso and we're going to talk about the lasso for a while, you may not want to hear that. But if I tell you we're going to use the lasso to look at Kobe Bryant's career, well, then now you're going to stick around. So not only are we going to look for those change points, but I'm going to throw in other features like, did he play better at home? Did it matter who he was playing against? Did it matter how much rest he had? And that kind of stuff. So here's the results of my model. This is as a function of the game and his career. So the vertical axis is the points per game. So you can see he started off pretty low. This first vertical dashed line is when he became a starter, and he kept going up and up until he was about 1,000 games into his career, and that's sort of where he plateaued, and then he started to decline. And if you see this big jump at the end, that's actually because he scored a whole lot of points in his final game. That was enough to create a change point right there at the end. But we can see he kind of gradually progressed, hit his prime, and then slowly declined over the last 500 games or so of his career. But just as important as scoring, if you put me out there, I could score 30 points a game against NBA opponents. I'd have to shoot the ball probably a couple hundred times. So what's also important is to look at his efficiency. So we're going to use points per field goal attempt, right? So that's a measure of efficiency. And what's really cool here is he kind of has a blip here in his first season, but then it's flat for the first 1,000 or so games of his career. So that's really cool. 1,000 games is about 10 seasons or so. So for the first 10 or 11 seasons, he was really consistent in terms of his efficiency. And I should mention also these gold zones. These are years where the Lakers won the NBA championship. But if you look at other things like rebounding assists, that's not nearly as consistent. And that kind of makes sense. Kobe was a shooting guard. His job was not to rebound or to get assists, but when he needed to, he did it. But that's why those numbers are all over the place. So in addition to those change points, we also saw that Kobe tended to play better against the Jazz and the Warriors and the Blazers. And remember, when Kobe was playing, the Warriors were not what they are now. So they were a much worse team. And he actually didn't really prefer a lot of rest. He tended to do better on back-to-back games or with just 2 games of rest. And when did he struggle? He struggled especially against the Spurs and the Pistons, which is not surprising in those years that Kobe was playing. Those 2 teams had really good defenses. And he also struggled on the road early in his career, not so much later in his career, but earlier in his career he struggled on the road, which makes sense. He's a young player learning his way. And so I want to mention I don't really like comparing great players, especially when they played in different eras, right? But another pretty good shooting guard went to college in Chapel Hill where I grew up, and When I presented this for the first time, I presented it in Chicago, and you'll see why that matters. We're going to compare Kobe to Michael Jordan. And we're not really talking about who's better. That's a totally different discussion. My question is, did Kobe and Jordan age similarly? If we look at that graph, are they going to have a similar decline at the end of their career? And if we look at points per game, this red line is Michael Jordan smoothed out, Kobe's in purple. You can see that it's kind of a similar decline. Jordan was sort of uniform, he scored more at each point in his career, but he sort of had a similar shape. But what really stands out is their efficiency. So if you look at these lines, they share an almost identical shape in the last, the last 8 or 9 years of their career. And it's a little bit tricky too, because Michael Jordan retired twice. That's what these faded lines are. But it's kind of remarkable how closely their decline reflected each other. So we used the generalized regression platform to look at Kobe's career, and we saw that his decline was very similar to Michael Jordan's decline. So maybe that criticism that Kobe got in his last couple seasons, that probably wasn't fair, because his decline was very similar to that of Michael Jordan, who's widely considered one of the best players of all time. And the bigger picture, it's really interesting to look at how players age and how they recover from injury. If you're in a management type job in the NBA or other leagues, you want to know how players tend to perform at the end of their career after they get hurt. So just real quick, we'll look at how we did this. So I've got my data set here. We've got points, minutes played, all kinds of numbers. We're going to launch the generalized regression platform. So what I'm modeling here is my points per field goal attempt. So when I was doing this for my slides, I looked for a change point at every single game. And because Kobe played over 1,500 games, in total, I was doing variable selection on 2,000 or 3,000 variables, and that takes a while. So for now, we're just going to look at a change point in every 5 games. And I'm going to look at home court advantage, their interaction, how much rest he has, month, day of the week. And I set the personality to generalized regression. My distribution is gamma because I think there's skewness, but there's also 0, so it's 0 inflated. So I'm going to ask for the lasso. And this is relatively quick, but we can go ahead and stop it. And here we have this graph summarizes the variable selection process. And what we really want, and you can see here too, a lot of these these parameter estimates have been set to 0. But what we're most interested in is the profiler. And we can take a look. This leftmost pane is a lot like those piecewise constant graphs we were looking at. We can see when we move around, here's where we can see the home court advantage. It peaks up. He plays a little bit worse on 3 days of rest, a little bit worse in June. That makes sense. It's probably the finals. And what's interesting here too is he plays a little bit worse on Mondays. So even Kobe Bryant gets a case of the Mondays, which means us regular people are doomed. How can we not have problems on Mondays as well? But yeah, that's it for me. Thanks, Julian.
Thanks so much, Clay. Super interesting. And we'll see if you can put up that data and any journals you're willing to share too on our community pages. I'm sure people would love to play with those data as well. In our next segment, we have Tim Chartier here, professor of mathematics and computer science at Davidson College, to take us through Jump into Sports Analytics. Welcome so much, Professor Chartier.
Great. Thank you. Let me switch over to my slides so that we can look at those. Great. All right, so first of all, I want us to look at JMP from an academic point of view. Since I'm a professor, I use JMP with students. And the first slide kind of puts that all into perspective, which is who am I? And at the bottom, you see the logo for Cat Stats, which we are the Davidson Wildcats. And so the Cats is our logo, or our mascot, if you will. And then the stats is the analytics part. So we're a group that does sports analytics for our teams. And it started with men's basketball. If you follow basketball, we were supplying analytics to the men's basketball team originally. It was just after Steph Curry came that we started. And it was a very successful team. So we weren't entirely sure that we could actually offer analytics that would be helpful. But by the end of even the first season, we were very much part of the team, supplying analytics each time the team ended a game. They would have analytics for the next game, sometimes even before that, so that they could think through practice and strategies. From there, we began to work with official professional teams. We've worked with teams in the NBA, NFL, and NASCAR, given my location. I'm in North Carolina, so if we were not in a self-quarantine time in 5 minutes, well, in 5 minutes, I could still be at some of the NASCAR shops, but in this era, I wouldn't be able to go in, but in other times you can. From there, we've fielded questions from national media like the New York Times, ESPN, and then some of my alums have moved into sports jobs. One student who is one of the founders of the group works for the Bulls, another works for the Jets, and then the students go into a lot of data analytics jobs. For instance, one is working at Microsoft. At this point, we work more broadly than basketball. We work with men and women's basketball, volleyball, baseball, football, and men and women's soccer. So that's who we are. So one of our big parts is that math and computer science, with a combination of data, can have an impact in terms of where we are. The biggest thing about the group is it's very large. We're a school of 2,000, approximately 2,000, and we're currently right around 100 students are part of the data analytic group. I never ask someone's major, and we always say if you want to be part, you have a role. Some people are much newer to the field and will do more kind of data entry, if you will. The picture that you saw on the previous slide here were actually students getting ready to record shots during a game. The NBA has cameras that look down and get spatial information. We do it either during the game or we do it off a video later in the game. And so one of the nice things about JMP is that with students who are, for instance, first-year students, they may not have as much background, and something like regression is a little too much to expect them to pick up. And JMP has tools in it that are better than anything else I've found that enable them to move quickly and begin to get insight. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about today, is that if you're new to analytics, JMP can be the tool that lets you jump in. And if you're experienced in analytics, JMP, of course, as we've already seen in the previous two talks, lets you do some pretty detailed analytics. The big tool that I tend to introduce students to is the partition tool, which enables you to create essentially decision trees. So we're going to look at two things. We're going to look at Major League Baseball and try to get the story behind something, very similar in feel to what we saw Sig do earlier. And then we're going to look at March Madness, which has a basketball feel. Rather than being in the NBA like Clay, it will be college basketball. So our question with Major League Baseball was just simply, who makes the All-Star game? Fans vote for the starting lineups, not for pitchers. And then the rest are voted on by players, coaches, and managers. So we did this analysis actually in 2013, quite a while ago. This was actually with some colleagues and I when we were learning JMP at a professional development workshop on data science. And we were analyzing only the 2012 All-Star data, mainly just because we were interested in the project. But it produced results very quickly, which is mainly what I'm trying to emphasize to you today. So we had quite a bit of data in there. As we've seen in the previous talks, you can, of course, have a lot of data. And for partition trees, it's quite good to have a lot of data because it kind of slices through it all. So you have the traditional data that we're used to, the games, game started, plate appearances. We have player characteristics like the height, weight, the birth month. I'm not sure we found anything with August, but maybe we should have looked more carefully that we saw earlier with Sig. And then the one that we added that took a specific amount of scraping was the number of Twitter followers. It'll be important to remember that this is 2013. So having followers in the hundreds of thousands was a lot of Twitter followers back in 2013, which will be relevant to us later. We wrote a scraper that went out to Twitter and pulled down all of the number of followers because there was a site that listed at least a large percentage of the Twitter handles for Major League Baseball players. So we were able to pull that pretty quickly. Then we had some of the more non-traditional stats, as you see there, total bases and double plays and so forth. So that's what we had in terms of our data. So with partition, you put it in, you put your data into JMP, as we saw with Clay. You would have it there, and then you go to analyze partition, and then you ask it to split. And on the first split, it's what you have is all the data as your variables, as your inputs, if you will, and then the output is a 1 or a 0. So you can think of it as a very rudimentary, quick way to kind of look at logistic regression. So the predictive is you became an all-star or you didn't. If you can only pick one thing, you're not going to get the kind of multi-inference of multiple variables, but if you can only pick one thing, what's the best predictor of whether or not you are an all-star? And it turned out that it was total bases, is that if total bases is greater than or equal to 141, that was the best predictor. If it's less than 141, which is the one I want to look at, I didn't put on the slide first, but I want to talk about that one, is that if you split again, if you're less than 25 RBIs, forget it. Nobody is an all-star in terms of the way that that actually plays out. If you go the other direction and you're greater than or equal to 141, then if your total bases is actually greater than or equal to 175, then you're an all-star. This goes a lot to what Sig was saying earlier, is that it enables you to look at the data, very quickly parse through it, and begin to look at the story behind it in terms of what is the data telling you. And then if you do regression, logistic regression and such things, you can move quickly into that arena with the analysis as well. I've had people use it both ways. The cleaver on there is just because partition, it's just the click of a button, which I think I had the easy button earlier, is you're just clicking a button, which sometimes doesn't feel like you're doing a lot of data analytics. But part of the beauty of JMP is that it takes a lot of that burden off of you so that you can be thinking what you're doing, not always how you need to be doing it, which is very helpful. You get to use the tool and it makes it very easy to use so you can pick the right tool and try a number of them. So it turns out that if you do a number of splits, our favorite result was that if the total bases is less than 141, so you're not performing really well in terms of total bases, your RBIs are greater than or equal to 25, because if they're not, again, you are not an all-star. And then your on-base percentage is greater than or equal to 337. Then you have a chance to be an all-star. But it turns out that the best bet of being an all-star, if all of those things are there, and there's not a great chance you're going to be an all-star, it comes down in that particular year, in 2012, to Twitter followers, is that if you have over 100,000 Twitter followers, you're an all-star. So if you're popular, which probably means that you've been popular over time, then there may be some leniency in some of your stats, which was a fun discovery for us, and again, a very quick one for us to find. So we may do this in coming years as well. And that was a fun one for us. It's a little harder for me as an academic because the students are home. Maybe this year, if we get back to having sports in the summer, if we're still in some form of quarantines, a lot of the students, even during the academic year, were asking for projects just because they're home and they want to work and analyze games. Let's look at another one. I do a lot of work with March Madness. Every March, my phone begins to ring. It actually begins ringing even in January, from media who are asking questions about the coming March Madness tournament. And so one of the things that's often asked by the media is which giants, which big teams seem to be ready to fall, and which teams are potentially positioned to be a Cinderella. Prior to UVA's loss to UMBC in 2018, I was asked every year, do you think that there could be a 16 seed that would beat a 1 seed? And the answer was typically, the probability says it should have already happened. The interesting thing is that in many ways, UMBC was not the 16 seed that many of us saw as being the one ready to be that upset team, and yet they won by so much, as we'll see in a minute. So what we did was we wondered after the game, about 6 months later when we were getting ready for the 2019 tournament, the tournament a year ago, we were wondering, well, what could partition tell us about that matchup between UVA and UMBC? So all we did was take the game logs off of sportsreference.com. We saw Sports Reference site with Sig earlier. He was looking at baseballreference.com. That was one of the sites he was looking at. And we were interested in, if you take the game log, the statistics that you had for the game, and then in this case, the predictive element, the 1 and the 0, is did you win or did you lose? That's what we were interested in finding. The important part of this is that UVA did not lose a lot that year. And so we actually went back 4 years, because you have some continuity of players if they play for 4 years, but more importantly, we had the same coach for both teams in terms of what we had. So you can debate whether you thought that was the case, but in terms of what we did, that's what we're going to see. So we put all of that into JMP, and then we partitioned. And we found that UVA, the big predictor, was if they held an opponent to less than 59 points, then they would win. If they allowed greater than or equal to 59 points, they only won 53% of their games. And the final score in that huge historic upset was 74-54, with UMBC being the one, of course, that got to 74. Well, we partitioned more, and we found that if they did allow more than 59 points, and interestingly took less than 17 free throws, then suddenly they only won 20% of the time. In that upset, UVA only took 8 free throws. So that was one of those predictors that begins to tell you that some of the dynamics that they need, if you will, to lose were beginning to line up. The next one that we found is that 25 of the 26 UVA losses over that 4-year came against teams with a turnover rate less than 18.4%. Well, UMBC, the 2018 average was 17.2%. Again, another one of those dominoes, if you will, lining up so that they could fall consecutively and, if you will, lead to the loss. So that was an interesting one that we found as well. And then finally, I think this may be the last one. When UMBC recorded greater than or equal to 15 assists and held opponents to less than 46% field goal percentage, UMBC over that 4-year period went 32-0. They won every game. Well, can you think what happened in that game? Well, if you look at the game, UMBC had 15 assists. They hit the mark, and UVA was held only to 41% field goal percentage. So you begin to see, again, that checkbox of the types of things that they needed to actually lose. So where did we go with that? That just explains something in the past that's descriptive in terms of what was happening. Well, it turned out we shared this information with a sports analyst who covered the ACC tournament and also March Madness, and we were supplying these types of statistical information about two teams that were going to play so that ESPN and CBS Sports had those prior to the game. The idea being that, first of all, when you listen to the broadcasters prior to a game, they will often talk about, this is what I think UVA needs to have happen to win the game. This is what I think UMBC needs to have happen to win the game. Then the other part that it could play in is that maybe you didn't talk about those dynamics, but you have them ready so that when the game is playing out, you can begin to point out, well, good grief. If you just go back to the previous slide, UMBC has hit their 15 assists. That one, they hit exactly 15, so you really wouldn't see that. But you could talk about whether they're on the mark to hit that type of statistic, and then the field goal percentage of the opponent. And so we were able to supply that to ESPN and CBS Sports. So one of my favorite things about this that I hope is clear in this is that it enables people to just jump into sports analytics. Having a sports group where I say at the opening meeting, if you want to play a part, you have a role. JMP plays a huge part in that for us, is that we have a JMP workshop in the fall, students come, and the UVA UMBC analysis was actually done by a first-year student who'd only been in college for like a month and a half or 2 months. And I said, as an aside, at the end of our internal JMP workshop, I think this would be interesting to look at. He had that analysis that you saw 2 days later. And then it led us to working with ESPN and CBS, as you saw. The last part that I really like is something that I often say to students, is that one of the things I like a lot about sports analytics is that my goal is for students to have the courage to take your own thoughts seriously. That's a quote by Albert Einstein. Is that even today, as you've looked at what people have been talking about, is that what are the questions that you have? Do you have questions about birthdays and other sports? Do you have questions about the performance of other athletes? Do you have a question about another part of Kobe Bryant's career, the extended layoff of Michael Jordan, or even LeBron James in a different series that you could look at? I think that JMP is a tool that enables students to actually free themselves from parts of the analytics and very easily be able to use them to then be able to listen to their own thoughts, their own questions, and pose them. For me, the partition tool in particular is one that enables students to springboard forward, motivate them, and then enable us to begin to talk about courses and even online learning to broaden their toolkit of sports analytics that they can use within JMP. And in some cases, they're doing it within, for instance, like Python, when they're scraping some of the more advanced scraping data sets that we've created for some of the subcontracts we have with businesses. So that's what I have for you today. I hope it's helpful, and it's the type of thing that you can play with when you are in quarantine. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Tim. You have some really lucky students to get your perspective. So thank you for taking the time to share with us as well. In our next segment, we have Joseph Bryant, founder of Quality Statistics, here to take us through statistics for fantasy football. Welcome, Joseph.
Thank you, Julian. So I am going to talk a little bit about predicting wide receivers. Let's see, make sure that I pull everything up. Good. So, hey everyone, my name is Joseph Bryant. I am, the founder, creator of Quality Statistics. I created this a few years ago to kind of publish some results and try to predict wide receivers and a few other positions. But today I'm going to be talking about predicting wide receivers. So a little bit about me before I get into all the normal stuff. I started out as a mechanical engineering major at the University of Georgia, go Dogs, and I ended up earning a Bachelor of Science in Statistics. I fell in love with the idea of statistics and really its ability to use regression to predict the future. I think that's one of the coolest things in the world, that we can use past events to predict future events. So I think it's, almost like a superpower. So I think it's really cool. And I started a Twitter page to share some of these findings and, hopefully inspire others to, learn some statistics and maybe, try to predict their own stuff. So a little bit of background on, what we'll be talking about today. We'll be talking about wide receivers specifically on a game-by-game basis. So we're not trying to predict the 2020 season. We're not trying to predict if a player is going to break out or anything like that. We are trying to predict how a player will do next week. We're, on the current week we're on, how are they going to do next week? And for our purposes, we'll be talking about PPR fantasy. So that's points per reception. So a wide receiver gets a point every time they catch the ball. And then all the data that I'll be using throughout this entire presentation came from NFL Scraper. It's a package in R. It's a fantastic package. And I used the last 5 years to kind of, not use the last 20 or something, but they have a lot of data that you can use. So before we get into any of the data modeling, I kind of wanted to talk about some underlying assumptions and some jargon. So really all of this boils down to luck. At the end of the day, picking the best player is mostly random, but we can do a few things to help those odds. And any football fan knows that some of our best public projections like ESPN, NFL Network, Yahoo really aren't that great. I'm not saying that they're not great for what they are, but they are just like rankings. ESPN will usually just rank the best wide receivers and call it a day. But we really want to do a little bit more than that and try to predict exactly how a wide receiver is going to do in a given week. So we can see here, this is just a distribution of every wide receiver in 2019. This is just every single receiver that got a target. And we can see that our chances of picking the best wide receivers really aren't that great. It's very skewed and with a very high standard deviation compared to the mean. So we want to increase this distribution. We want to find a way to pick those receivers at the top. So how can we do that? So some terms that I'll be using a lot, air yards, and comparing those to receiving yards, for instance. So air yards is a very helpful metric. It was popularized by Josh Hermsmeyer in evaluating wide receiver performance. So air yards are the yards that the ball travels in the air to the wide receiver. It's a pretty simple metric, but often not talked about. And it doesn't matter if the wide receiver actually catches the ball. So that's an important note because we care about the yards that we were trying to give to the wide receiver, not necessarily the yards that the wide receiver obtained. And air yards help us project opportunity. So here's a quick little example I made of a play in football. So here's a 10-yard pass. The quarterback throws a 10-yard pass to the wide receiver. Wide receiver catches the ball, and then the wide receiver runs 20 yards with it. So they catch the ball, run 20 yards. Pretty simple. So in this recap, in this example, the everywhere, ESPN, NFL Network, Yahoo, they would record that as a 30-yard reception. So in fantasy football, this would be 4 points. 1 point for the catch, and then 3 points for the 30 yards. But we really know it's a little bit more than this, right? It was a 10-yard catch, and then 20 yards run after catch, or yards after catch, yak. So in this example, we have 10 air yards, 20 yak yards, that end up being 30 receiving yards. And in football, it is much easier to predict these 10 air yards than it is to predict these 20 yak yards. And that's because air yards are stable. So air yards are much more predictable than receiving yards. Quarterbacks and coaches, they all have their preferences. They like players more than others. So targets and air yards are how those players and coaches show their preferences. So we can predict their preferences, and the preferences are more stable than receiving yards. And then air yards and targets are the most stable tracked variable for wide receivers. So air yards and targets are publicly available. Some of the best stats aren't actually publicly available, but these are, and we can use these to further help our analysis. So here's a graph of receiving yards versus a 3-week moving average of receiving yards. So just an example of one dot on this would be week 4 receiving yards would be the y-axis, and then an average of weeks 1, 2, and 3 would be the x-axis. And we see we have about a 0.17 r squared. Well, if we do the same exact thing for air yards, we can see that our r squared goes up by about 0.06, which is fantastic for what we're dealing with. So this is air yards in the current week, and then a 3-week moving average of air yards on the x-axis. So having a 0.06 increase is fantastic for what we're dealing with. Even 0.01 would be a big deal, but 0.06 is great, and we can tell the air yards is much more stable than receiving yards. And then here are a few other variables if you care. I'm going to be talking about a few of these in some of what I've done in the past. So we have market share, which is just air yards divided by the team's total air yards. This shows you how many air yards are you getting compared to the rest of your team. We have target share. That's just the same thing, targets divided by the team pass attempts. So that's showing us how much are you, how much are you trying to get the ball, or how much are the coaches and quarterbacks getting you the ball compared to the rest of the team. We have ADOT, which shows us what types of receivers you are. So it's just air yards and divided by targets. This shows us, are you a deep threat wide receiver? Are you a short threat wide receiver? What kind of receiver are you? And we have two of the more complicated metrics at the bottom, and that's RECR and WOPR. RECR is it shows how much are you converting your opportunity into fantasy points. So we're giving you air yards. How are you converting those air yards into receiving yards, which is what we really care about at the end of the day. And then WOPR, which is weighted opportunity ranking. It's another thing made by Josh. It's just a good combination of target market share and air yards market share, and really shows you how much, on a weighted basis, how much opportunity are you really receiving. And then I'm going to be saying this a lot, but regressing to the mean. So it's an important assumption that we have that every player in the NFL is always regressing towards their mean. So regression is inevitable, just like Thanos, right? Good games do not always imply more good games, and bad games do not always imply more bad games. And the more opportunity a player receives will always eventually lead to a good game. We don't know how long that'll take, but if a player is receiving a lot of opportunity, they'll eventually have a good game. But then, I guess on the counter side of that, is sometimes a player is just bad. or they're in a bad situation. For instance, about 2 years ago when I was predicting quarterbacks, Josh Rosen kept showing up in my model, and the model kept saying, Josh Rosen is going to have a good game. He's eventually going to have a good game. And if you remember 2 years ago, Josh Rosen on the Arizona Cardinals, he never had a good game. The Cardinals were horrible. They ended up being the worst team in the NFL. And Josh Rosen just never had a good game because his situation wasn't good, and maybe a little bit of him just wasn't good. So sometimes a player is just bad, and we have to recognize that as people sometimes. When a player keeps showing up in our model, are they just bad? So here's an example of kind of that regressing to the mean point in a graph. We can see this is just median fantasy points on a week-to-week basis, partitioned on underperformed. And what the underperformed variable is wide receivers who received more opportunity the previous week than they actually converted into fantasy points. So if a player underperformed relative to their air yards, they got a 1. If they did what they were supposed to, they got a 0. And we can see that players who underperformed the previous week always outperform players who just did what they were supposed to do. So when players underperform, they tend to bounce back. They regress to their mean. So summary of kind of, our assumptions and some of the jargon. Regression is inevitable. I'll say it again. Regression is inevitable. And then air yards is a stable predictor of opportunity. And it lets us know what coaches and quarterbacks want to do for their team, right? Who are we throwing the ball to? Are we throwing it to Julio Jones, or are we throwing it to Calvin Ridley, for example, for the Falcons? It lets us know who the coaches want to get the ball to. And then picking the player is almost a matter of luck, but there are a few things that we can do to increase our chances. So let's talk about a little bit about increasing those chances. So on a week-to-week basis, I try and predict the next week. So I do this after week 3, so I have a little bit of data to work with. And I started doing this 2 years ago just for fun, and thankfully people kind of liked it, and more people paid attention than I originally thought. So last year I did this for running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends. And like I said earlier, I did quarterbacks in 2018, but I didn't feel super great about the model, and it had a few flaws. So I took it down for 2019, and I reworked some things, and I'm going to bring it back in 2020. So that's exciting. And what I do on a week-to-week basis is really more than just a model. I don't think just a model, like I said earlier, ESPN and NFL Network, I don't think a model really does everything you need it to, right? It needs to do more. So I create one model that predicts fantasy points. It has a 0.3 validated R-squared, which I'm pretty happy with that. One day we'll get that higher. But I also use JMP to create k-means clusters for wide receiver distributions. And I create a spreadsheet of a few various key indicators that help us, increase that distribution that we saw earlier, make our chances a little bit better in this lottery that we're playing, right? So like I said, I do k-means clustering. This is just one of the clusters. I use 5 different variables, as you can see there. And this helps create tiers of wide receivers, right? This helps us create a few different tiers, and we can use this to see, is a wide receiver moving between tiers, or are they staying in the same tier? So this is what this looks like on a week-to-week basis. So we can see that cluster 1 consistently beats clusters 2 and cluster 3, right? Cluster 2 isn't that bad, but if a player falls into cluster 3, we're gonna probably ignore them, right? Those are players that aren't doing that great. They're players that really have low fantasy impact, and most people probably aren't gonna be picking up on their teams or playing in a week. So we can really ignore cluster 3, given the, depending on what we're given. Remember, regression is inevitable. So I keep saying it, but how do we actually quantify it, right? So we keep saying that regression is inevitable, but what do we do to quantify this variable? The way that I chose to quantify it is I try to predict what the wide receiver's average fantasy points should be. So what should that average be on a given week? And then compare it to what that average actually is. And this, we can create a key indicator and a new variable using this. And we can see that when we compare fantasy points in a given week to the residuals of average minus the predicted average, we get about a 0.1 R-squared. Remember earlier I said 0.1, that's pretty good. That's a pretty good variable. But I think that we can take this a step further. So we have this continuous variable, but if we break it into a binary variable, and I called it rebound, we can see that players who are anticipated to rebound, players that, earned a 1, they're on the higher end of, the spectrum, they're on the far right of the spectrum. We can see that players who are anticipated to rebound almost perform twice as well as players who aren't anticipated to rebound, which is a really cool observation and something that we can use to help increase our chances, right? Which distribution would you rather pick from? If you were just going in and picking blindly, remember this is the lottery, would you rather pick from a distribution of 1 or a distribution of 0, right? So we can use these to help increase our chances. And then the last key indicator I kind of wanted to talk about was the underperformed. You saw the week-by-week graph earlier, but this is just if a wide receiver underperformed relative to their air yards. So if they received, what I did for this one, if they received 35 more air yards than they actually had receiving yards, I counted them, they underperformed that week. So, and that was just a judgment call on my end. I mean, that could really be anything, but so far the best results seem to be about 35 yards. And in this case, we can see that wide receivers with a distribution of 1 far outperform wide receivers with a distribution of 0. And so we want to try to pick from distributions of 1 when we can. So what does all of this mean, right? This is what our final output kind of looks like. After we do everything that we talked about, this is what I publish on a week-to-week basis. This was actual week 5 predictions and results. So the only thing different in this is that far right column, I added the actual fantasy points so that we could see, now that we're in the future, see how I did. So each week I highlight players before the week starts that I think have a high chance of success based on the model. This is based on the model and based on real life circumstances, people that have a high chance of success. So I highlight them green, and then I pick my player of the week. I try to pick, a player that I think is just going to blow up and do well. I try to pick them in dark green. And you can see that the player I picked this week, it was Julio Jones. He did horrible, which I remember being very embarrassed about that. Because normally I do pretty good, but this week it was not great. But I was still pretty happy about this week all in all. And also players that I do in yellow, those are players that the model and I like, but there's something in real life that may cause problems. For instance, Cole Beasley this week, I remember he had a hamstring injury, or he had a hip injury actually, and Amari Cooper had a small hamstring injury. And I remember I did Trey Quinn, you can see he's in yellow. I highlighted him yellow because he had a high chance of success. I remember the number 1 wide receiver was out that week, and it was his time to shine, and the model kind of liked him, and it was just ready. Everything was set up. But Trey Quinn has a bad quarterback. So I didn't really feel comfortable making him a green pick. I didn't feel comfortable green lighting him because his quarterback's not that good. So how's he going to get the ball, right? So I didn't feel super comfortable doing that, but you can see that that's kind of what the output looks like. But I reorganized it by fantasy points over on the right, so we can see how did we really do in the grand scheme of things. And we can see that we actually identified 3 of the top 6 or 5, 3 of the top 5 best players in a given week, which is 60% success rate. That's pretty good. And we ended up identifying the best player, Will Fuller, that week, which I was very happy about. But as you can see, I still missed on some players, right? I missed on Michael Thomas. I missed on DJ Chark. I missed on Chris Godwin. I missed on some of the other players because it's really hard to, hit them all, and you can't miss them all either. So hitting 6 out of 19 was pretty good, and hitting the top 3 out of 5, I felt fantastic about. So, this is kind of what I do on a week-to-week basis. I use Jump and R kind of together, in tandem to create this on a week-to-week basis and try to give a little bit more information than, say, ESPN or NFL Network does with just their weekly rankings that they come out with of wide receivers. So this is, full-on spreadsheet. I color-coded it. It looks like a Thanksgiving spreadsheet, and I publish that for everyone to see. So, thank you for, listening to everything. I just want to give a shout-out to Josh Hermsmeyer. He's at Frisco Josh on Twitter. And he's the creator of airyards.com, a fantastic resource if you want to look at, air yards and a ton of other metrics. But if you want to look at these metrics and everything, you can go to his Twitter or his website. Fantastic. And then NFL Scraper, which is an R package that basically has all the NFL data you could ever want. You just install it, get it set up, and you can follow them on Twitter. I think they have some instructions. There's a little bit more than a normal package you need to do. But, get all the data for the last like 20 years, I think is what they currently have. So that's pretty cool. I only did the last 5, but still a really cool thing. But in general, thank you for having me and listening to what I had to say. If you have any questions or just want to follow me on Twitter, feel free. It's at Quality Stats. Pun on quality, but Quality Stats. And thank you very much.
Outstanding. Thank you so much, Joseph. We'll make sure to put links to everything you pointed out there, including that art package, actually on the community page. We'll build that for you. And yeah, I like the quality. That's quality. That's very good. Thanks again for joining us on the program today. In our next segment, we have Sam Edgman, Principal Analytical Consultant at SAS, to take us through what the value is of a shot in hockey. Sam, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me here. Just want to echo what some of the other guys have talked about with concerning using sports and learning about statistics. I spent a lot of evenings scraping sports data to try to figure out how to win the Rocky Top Football League with guys that I'd been to college with. So just echo what Clay and Joseph have said, and it's really a good way to go. Sometimes I'm asked concerning hockey, how's the guy from Tennessee and now live in Georgia? How do you ever get involved with hockey? And kind of the answer I share is this: it wasn't a direct path. I wrote a blog that you can see on the screen here about Kobe Bryant's shots, and someone from a hockey team saw this and contacted SAS and then asked if we could do this with their data. And I said, well, I think we can. So we created this and it had all their shots on it. And that led us down a path of being able to do analytics for a hockey team and actually being involved in the way they approach the game. And the conversations that we went through initially was it was kind of hard because I didn't know the game. I know football, I know basketball, I know baseball, but this was a new thing to me. So I went back to the foundations of what I knew about analytics. And in those foundations was this. I knew baseball, as I said, and when I was growing up, I took a book from Bill James that was sent out annually, and then I got it. I think it was quarterly, but it was full of stats, and I studied those stats all the time. And once upon a time, he came out and said, "Well, I've got this theorem I call the Pythagorean theorem for baseball that I can use to estimate the winning percentages of teams." What we could do with that then was think about if we can affect, either the R or the RA, which R is the runs scored and RA is runs scored against. If we can affect one of those, then we can affect the winning percentage. And so in baseball, and again, this is kind of how I set up talking to a hockey team. I said, there's a precedence for using analytics to gain advantage in sports. So I said, look at this. Look at this. I showed that equation. I said, this is pretty accurate. This is the Pythagorean estimation, that Bill James came up with, and this is the actual winning percentages. Very high R squared, it's very highly correlated. And then what baseball people did was then to go out and really study statistics and study the data and think about how they might use the data to gain more runs. So they looked at building models and understanding what really made a difference concerning scoring a run. A lot of people might have initially thought, well, you just need to fill up your roster with a bunch of people with great batting averages, and that has some validity. But there's other stats that, if you're really looking at it, has more to do with scoring a run than not. You see, batting average is good. The R squared is 0.668, but on-base percentage is a little bit better, 0.776. So what I was getting at there was to tell my hockey team that we need to come up with metrics that's going to help you understand and be able to strategize with your game. So that's what we started looking for. I had data that the NHL provides to hockey teams. They update it every day during the season, and that data, it's just tons of information about literally every play that happens in a game. So I had 3 years of data, like I say, with everything recorded, and that happens in a game. And I started studying that information just as I was learning the game. So that's kind of a key, because I'm just learning here. So I want to find something that's kind of the equivalent of baseball's on base percentage for hockey. So when I started watching games, and I became a fan, I'm a big fan now. I love the game. But whenever I would see scores listed on TV, well, they'd always show the number of shots. So I thought, well, that has to be important. So I did a simple little regression on that, and what it came out with was saying, well, it looks like if you take more and more shots, you're going to score less goals, which that's probably worth conversation in itself. But then as I was learning more, and about that time, let's say going back about 5 years or so, shots on goals started showing up in the scores, as you'd see a score as shots and shots on goals. So that had to be the thing that we wanted to get. So let's see how that looked, and it does look a little bit better as compared to just taking shots. But still, it's not a great R-square. And as I use that graphic that I showed you earlier to see that, they're calling shots as shots on goal literally all over the ice. About like someone just flinging a ball from the opposite end of a basketball court, and if it hit the backboard, then we're going to call that a shot. A shot on goal. So I kept looking for other things that would be a better metric for a team to use, that would help them understand how they can score more goals. I went to the data that had been provided to me, and just scanning the data, and I noticed things in the data like X and Y coordinates. And there's there's information about distance, and then there's lots of information about sections, and of course there's information about whether it's a goal or not. And that really started to look to me like the makings of a model, where I might be able to look at this information and build a model that would tell me the probability that a goal would be good whenever someone took it. Now, this is not the model that we built for the team. It's just an example of taking those X and Y coordinates, maybe this distance data and what section of the ice that the shot was made from, and then just building a model such that it might look something like this, and it'd give us something to talk about what's important and what's not. But what started kind of hit home for the guys was whenever I could say, look, now here's the number, and if you notice this information being added over here to the side, this column is actually the probability of a goal going in, just with the data that I just built this model with. And this is what I started calling the shot value. And then whenever I would tabulate the data such that I could take the average shot value for a game, and start calling it SVG. That it was just kind of building up some terminology here. And the idea was I wanted to find a metric that would help teams or my team understand how to better score. So I've developed this model. I've called the output the shot value for a shot, and then I've put and summarized the data and the average for a game basis, with the idea that, well, is this information interesting or not? So now I want to go back to this developing the metrics as we was talking about, where we're talking about, remember we're talking about the shots and the shots on goal. Well, let's take a look to see how shot value might hold up to that as well. As you guys might have guessed, it's a little bit better. So when I presented this to my team, the response wasn't overwhelming. It wasn't like, this is the greatest thing we've ever seen. It was, they looked at me with just blank looks and said, we can't coach to this. We can't essentially manage a team by this. It wasn't the response I was looking for. But I had a slide that I pulled up to share with them. It's kind of anticipation that you might get a response like that. And that slide showed, and I wish I had that slide to share with you because it was a big deal. That slide showed that every single team in the league that had a better record than my team did also had a better shot value per game metric. So what happened was the team, is the Boston Bruins. Boston Bruins was not in the playoffs when we started this, and they obviously came within a game of winning everything last year. They did start to consider how they could improve this metric. We could use that graphic that I showed you earlier to demonstrate that they weren't taking great shots. They essentially made fun of me a lot for using basketball analogies because that's what I played. And I said, it's like a team not shooting at the 3-point line, but going 8 feet behind it. This is kind of what you're doing right now. So you've got to improve that. And just as a basketball team might, if they want to improve their shot chances, they might want to get a player that can get out and create some goals on their own. So they might look for more breakaways. So what we ended up doing was with that graphic, we put the shot value, and we could do this for games, so we could study games, or we could do it for seasons, and we could do it against other teams, and kind of use it for strategy. But you can see how, as you move this, how the good zone, the zone with the best shot value starts to reveal itself here. As you would suspect, the more I increase the shot value, the more we're pulling right into the goal itself. It starts to look like an arrow, if you notice. It's pointing the direction to the goal. But that is what we've initially done for the Bruins. They've essentially changed the way they attack the net, changed the way they're drafting, changed the way they've picked players up in free agency. This is something that's very relevant in their mind, knowing that they need more shots in specific areas. And so the first thing you hear after the 7th game loss was, well, we followed this path, but then we went against the West, and the West has big and very strong players. And that was a problem with our smaller and very quick players. So, as with anything, now it's time to improve the analytics so we can deal with that. So that's where we are right now. And that is my presentation on how to value a shot in the National Hockey League.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Sam. I love those graphics in Jump too. I think you may have some questions on how to make your own hockey rink visual like that. And so we'll maybe take those over at the community space, community.jump.com/jumponair. And I may follow up with you to see if we can get maybe some of your journals or maybe even a data table or two. So thank you so much, Sam.
Thanks for having me.
Wonderful. Our next speaker is Caleb King, research statistician tester, back on the show. This time to talk about where Olympic champions are born. Welcome back to the show, Caleb.
Oh, thank you. All right, let me share my screen here. The one. All right, excellent. So, as you probably guessed, I'm a bit of an Olympics fan, if this little model here doesn't help with that. I'm also a big fan of maps and cartography in general. So, of course, when I found an excuse to combine the two, I was like, let's go for it. So, I do appreciate that Sig's talk, the first talk that we did through, because a lot of what he just showed for baseball is essentially what I will be showing you for the Olympics in general. So I didn't know he was going to be talking about that, so that was a pleasant surprise. So you might see a lot of overlap in what we do, and I think that's cool. So to start, I'm going to start off a bit with a question, but actually before I get to that, I'm going to be looking at Olympic birthplaces, the birthplaces of Olympic athletes, and kind of along Sig's reasoning, kind of saying, where are certain production regions, if you will. Kind of looking more or less at a country level and more like within country, because we have this idea of the medal table and comparing countries that way. There's also, as Sam kind of hinted at in the previous talk, this idea of, okay, you're into ice hockey. Are you Canadian? Are you from Minnesota? there's a bit of a geographic, association with certain sports. So I definitely wanted to play around with that, but also look at it more of a more regional level. And I'm kind of using the Olympic athlete birthplace as a proxy for that. Now, of course, it's a very loose proxy because athletes move around. So just because you were born in one place doesn't mean you stayed there. So, it's a bit of a loose approximation, but I think it's still cool to kind of see some of the things we find. So I'll get back to that question. In your mind, think about if you had a particular city that had a sign out front saying, we have the most Olympic medals of all the cities. Here's all the years that we competed. Here's our total Olympic tally. Basically, think of a medal table, but by birth city. Who would be at the top? If you want to share in the comments, you can, or just keep it in mind. I'll come back to that before we get to the end, because it's kind of cool. It's a surprising response. But first, I'll kind of explore some of what I've been playing around with. So here we have a dashboard that I created, and this looks just at the medalists themselves. So we've got it color-coded based on the type of medal they've won. We have event. I can filter by sport over time. A lot going on here, and this was just sort of to help start encouraging exploration of, do we see any regional effects? Here I've got basketball. I thought I'd pick out some of the sports we've already talked about. Got basketball, which of course the U.S. tends to dominate in, and so we can kind of narrow in on that. We can kind of see maybe where most of your recent athletes have come from. We definitely see some trends there. So it's kind of cool to explore across different sports, all these types of regional trends that you can see. I kind of clear that out a bit. We can revisit baseball. Baseball was at one time an Olympic sport. I don't think it is now, but you can clearly see Cuba dominates there, as Sagan mentioned earlier. So that's kind of cool to see there. Again, just kind of exploring these geographic dispersions. And it really varies depending on the sport. So for example, I'll scroll up here all the way to alpine skiing. If you were to give a guess where you think most medalists in alpine skiing were born, you might guess probably close to the Alps, and you would be right. So it's kind of interesting. It definitely depends on the sport. So you have some where there's these clear clusters around a particular region. There's some where there's a lot more dispersion. So I'll play around with athletics. There's a lot more dispersion around there. There's some where there's clear, highlight areas, beach volleyball. So here in the U.S., definitely around California. just for the fun of it, we will do, oh, why not curling? So again, curling, and kind of just playing around. At this point, I'm just kind of playing around with different ways of visualizing these trends. So it's cool to see. Here we have figure skating, so we can see here in the US, especially different variations, and kind of using this as a springboard for further investigation, kind of like what Sig did with baseball is, oh, yeah, I see these particular regions. You kind of get it as an overall view here. We could look at football. Catch, it's not American football. This is actually what we Americans would call soccer. So the European or non-American football, so you can see clear locations there. Again, it's kind of cool to play around with that. And then, of course, I'll pull up ice hockey, which, as we might expect, Canada, northern US. So again, playing around with all of this. For most Olympic athletes, Los Angeles, good guess. Very good guess. We'll see. We will see. So again, I've kind of got it all here in this nice contained dashboard, and we can look at it again by event, or we can look at it over time. I definitely want to explore this sort of over time because there's a lot of changes that I've seen happen over time in this data. So I'm going to come here to this plot. In this case, I'm showing density versus, I need to move this thing out of the way here real quick. Here we're looking at it. I've done some custom categorizations of time period. So I think I've got 4 or 5. There's sort of the early years, which would be in red. Let's see, let me pull up one that might have all of them. So let's look at athletics. There we go. I kind of categorized into 5 time periods. So there's the early years. So quick shout out, I pulled all this data. We've heard of baseballreference.com, basketballreference.com, generalsportsreference.com. So you can probably guess I pulled these from olympicsreference.com, which has all this information about the athletes from the very early games up until the 2016 games. Unfortunately, they don't have the most recent games in Pyongyang. And I think they're actually starting to phase out the website, which I was sad to see. So hopefully they replace it with a good site to pull from. But that's where I pulled out all this information. And so here I've done sort of custom categorizations of time, and we can definitely see trends, which I think is really cool to see these trends over time of where the athletes are coming from. Typically what you see is in the earlier years, there are a lot of athletes from the US, from Europe. They tend to dominate. It was mainly countries, those type of countries participating. It's only until after sort of World War II that you start to see a lot more dispersion, and it becomes an actual more global sporting event, if you will. So we can see in athletics where a lot of athletes are coming from, definitely more of the East African regions, which is kind of cool. In the sprints, you get the Caribbean. Again, we'll explore. There's baseball, which of course is dominated by Cuba when it was going on, but we also see some other countries, Korea and Japan as well. Let's see. The filters that govern multiple graphs. I will answer this question about dashboards, and probably in the community. So I'll get to you. Basketball, we can definitely explore. And again, you can see a lot of trends happening there. It looks like most of the density here is starting to move up north over time. And then, of course, some of my favorites, beach volleyball. That's actually one of my favorites. It's very action-packed. Sport, again, the non-American football as well. Gymnastics and so forth. And then, let's see. So these are just some of the highlights of things that I've been playing around with, kind of exploring these trends. One I want to kind of show you here at the end is, I believe it's wrestling. This is cool because you can see a clear change in time, how things kind of started over here and, Great Britain up here in Europe. And then over time, the medalists are kind of moving until you get over here. Forget the name of that geographic region, so I won't try and name it here. But you can see some cool trends here over time with these particular sports. So that's been something fun to investigate. At this point, I think I'm going to, well, one other thing I might show. Again, here's the data set, and I'll be happy to share this in the community forum. So this is just a summary of all the actual Olympic medalists. I do have a more complete set, but that might be a bit too big. So here, it's just all the medalists across all the Olympic athletes. Here, nope, it's actually in the other one that I was thinking of. I have another one here where I've summarized the number of medals by birthplace. So this is more at the city level. The other one was at the athlete level. I can make both of these available. In this case, I was going to show off something that Sig kind of showed off. And this is if we plot the mean latitude and longitude of the birthplaces for particular sports. So here it's gymnastics. We can, again, play things over time. It's kind of cool, especially with some of the athletics. If we play here, it's got to reset itself. And there we go. We can see kind of early on, it starts to bounce around. And then as you get in time, it starts to move around here towards the Caribbean. So again, these are all different ways of kind of exploring that. At this point, what I'll do is I'll transition to answer the question of which city has the most medals, because there's an interesting bit of history that you see in this that I want to highlight. So you've had your guesses, you've had time to think. So drum roll, please. Were you right? Unfortunately, for the person who guessed Los Angeles, I'm afraid they didn't even make the top 10. This was pretty surprising. So Moscow is at number 1 with over 640 medals. Budapest was really surprising. They came out of left field. I had no idea why, with almost 600. One of the cool things that we see here is this huge gap between Budapest and the next top one, Stockholm. It's almost twice as many. Oops, you got a little glimpse of where I'm going there. It's twice as many. So what was the reason behind this gap? So I started to look into this, trying to figure out what might explain this huge gap between these two cities and the remaining ones. And the first thing I did was, this is over all time, over all sports. Well, of course, let's break it down by sport. So we can do that. I'm going to use my little hover graphlets here to do that. And when we break it down, there are some things that we kind of expect. Ice hockey is the dominant sport where they got most of their medals. Water polo, I believe, is next, followed by fencing. That's kind of surprising. And you might think it's a bit unfair, with ice hockey, that's an entire team. Why are we counting all the individual medals in this? Well, to be honest, that's how the Olympic Committee does it when they compute their medal tables. So I'm going to use that same convention here. But again, you kind of see this not all of these high medal team sports are team-based. So, for example, fencing and figure skating. Gymnastics, there might be some teams in there, but not all of them. So there's not a clear favor. It's not all because of team sports. So I said, okay, that seems to get rid of that explanation. There might be some other explanations. Oops. Let's hover over on this guy. And here quickly, I decided, could we split it up by particular event? In this case, since this is ice hockey, there's just men's ice hockey for them. How many Hungarian medals are there from a city other than Budapest? That is a good question, and I don't know it off the top of my head, but again, I can make this data available. You could find out for yourself. If we have time, I might be able to explore. But one of the real things I really wanted to see was the counts over time. So you can see with the use of the graphlets, we're really able to delve into this. And you'll notice that the peak here is here in the 60s and 70s. And so that kind of gets you to hint at what might be going on here, especially if you're aware of a certain miracle that happened here in 1980. I'll give that as a little clue. We can go back. Okay, so there looked like there might be something with time. Maybe if we go into the other sports, do we see something similar there? So here we have, again, I'm grouping it here by gender group and event. Here it seems the men's water polo is where they tended to focus. Again, oops, let's highlight the time here. And again, we see a peak here in the 60s and 70s, kind of going off in the 80s, maybe a bit of a resurgence here. Okay, so there might be something here. Let's explore Budapest and kind of look in there. Here, for their top of sports, it's fencing. So clearly you can see there's not this trend towards team-based sports necessarily. Fencing, that seems surprising. Water polo, again, I guess it's another favorite. And canoeing. And again, we can look further. Okay, there's a lot of events in fencing. Are there particular ones? Well, in this case, yes, it is the team saber. Do we see any time trends there? In this case, it seemed to be, well, they seem to get a lot early on. And then there was kind of a jump and another jump here in the 60s, 70s, or in this case around the 80s. Again, so it seems like time might be having something going on here. So ultimately what I ended up doing, and if we want to explore real quick, let's see, maybe do the top 20. Maybe we can see where the next Hungarian city, there's Los Angeles. I believe this was number 10, so 11, 12, 13, 14 down. I'm guessing the other Hungarian cities might be a lot further down in that. But ultimately what I ended up doing, the plot that I think that really drove this home was this one. Now this shows the top 10 cities in terms of gold medal counts. And this is cumulative over time. So we see Stockholm. The list for top gold medals is similar to the total medals. You see Budapest really take off. If I were to do the commentary like the guy in the TED Talk, Moscow's coming from behind, taking the lead. Oh, he's taking the lead. No. What we see is this really big jump here in the 60s and 70s. And again, we see history in action. We, of course, know that we kind of like our Olympics to be free of politics. It isn't always. And so what we're seeing here is this emphasis in the communist states, the Warsaw Pact states, I guess, if you will, of this drive for athletic performance that a lot of us might be familiar with. So that's why we see that's why we see these two. Before this, I didn't know that Budapest was a very, prominent member of the Warsaw Pact, prominent city there, or at least Hungary was. I wasn't aware of that, so that's something new I learned while researching this. So Moscow kind of made sense. Budapest, that was surprising, so that's when I learned, it actually was a big player in all of this. So that's kind of cool to see history in action with this data. Just looking at counts of medals, you can discover something about history, which is something what I really like about all of this sports analytics. And just exploring this data, it kind of serves as that nice springboard for further investigation. You're able to learn new things, even based off what some might consider simple summary stats. You're able to learn some cool things. So I think that's about all I've got on my end. So unless there are any other questions, and again, I can make these available. So I'll make this table available, the birthplaces medal summary. You can kind of see where I've also been playing around with some of that partition modeling that we saw earlier. I don't have enough time to show those kind of results. And if you're trying to predict off of birthplace and time, I'll go and give you a heads up. It's not very strong. So there's obviously a lot of other factors that play in here. And I've also been encouraged to look at the athletic clubs, which is something else I'm kind of looking into as well. So I think with that, I will turn it over to Julian.
Outstanding. Thank you so much, Caleb. That was so interesting to see how much you can pull out of just some Olympic data. So I appreciate you sharing that on the community. Again, community.jump.com/jumponair is where you'll be able to get all of Caleb's data and all of any of the data that was shown in today's show or any of our shows. So make sure to head there after today's broadcast, interact with our speakers, get the data for yourself, or even watch past episodes. Be sure to follow us on all our different social media channels. We do share often and have a lot to share, so find us on all of those. Remember that this week is a special week. We had our sports episode today and our science episode on Friday. We don't have a Jump On Air broadcast on Wednesday. Instead, we hope you'll join us over at Statistically Speaking, jump.com/statspeaking, where we'll be doing one for data visualization for scientists and engineers. It's going to be a really great program, and we hope to see you over there. And we hope you'll join us Friday. But until then, we hope you stay safe, we hope you stay healthy, and we hope you stay close, even as you're keeping a distance. We'll see you again on Friday. Take care, everyone.